What if I told you that beneath the grand castles and glittering crowns of medieval Europe, there existed a secret history written not by kings, but by the hands of ordinary peasants? Picture a dusty wooden box tucked away in some forgotten corner of an ancient monastery, its contents untouched for centuries. Inside, 25 fragile letters, each one a fragile whisper from the past tells stories so powerful they threatened to topple empires. These aren't just scraps of parchment, they're lifelines connecting us to a world of quiet defiance, where the poorest and most oppressed found ways to make their voices heard against impossible odds. For generations, we've been taught that the Middle Ages were shaped by knights and monarchs, their battles and decrees echoing through history. But what about the people who tilled the soil, built the cities, and bore the weight of feudal oppression? Their stories were meant to disappear, burned by authorities, lost to time, or simply ignored. Yet somehow, against all odds, these 25 letters survived. They reveal a hidden tapestry of resistance, where peasants organized in secret, using coded language and hidden symbols to challenge the very foundations of power. Some letters plead for justice, others spark rebellions, and a few contain mysteries we're still unraveling today. This is more than just a journey into the past. It's a chance to hear voices that were deliberately silenced, to uncover the raw courage of people who risked everything for a shred of dignity. How did their words slip through the cracks of censorship? What can their struggles teach us about resilience, even in our own time? As we piece together these fragments of rebellion, you'll discover how a single letter could ignite a revolt, how a coded message could outsmart an army, and why these long-lost whispers still hold the power to move us centuries later. So let's open that wooden box together and listen to what history tried so hard to erase. The story of how these letters survived is almost as extraordinary as the words they contain. Imagine a small monastery tucked away in the hills of southern France, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. In the attic, beneath layers of dust and forgotten relics, a wooden chest sat untouched for generations. When a historian named Dr. Laurent Moreau first pried open its rusted hinges, he expected to find old ledgers or religious texts. Instead, his fingers brushed against something far more precious: bundles of fragile parchment, their edges frayed with age, each one carefully folded and sealed with wax that still bore the faint imprints of peasant hands. These weren't just random scraps. They were deliberate, dangerous documents smuggled out of villages under cover of darkness, passed from one trusted ally to another, and hidden in the last place feudal authorities would think to look: a monastery's archives where only scribes and clergy were allowed to tread. The letters date between the years 1250 and 1380, a time when peasant uprisings were brutally crushed and even whispering dissent could mean execution. Yet here they were, 25 acts of defiance preserved against all odds. What's even more astonishing is how they were written. Many of the letters use coded language, references to harvests that meant secret meetings, or complaints about bad weather that actually described oppressive taxes. Some were tucked inside seemingly innocent prayer books, while others were written in invisible ink made from crushed berries, only revealing their true messages when warmed by candlelight. The peasants who wrote them knew the risks. If caught, they wouldn't just face punishment. Their entire villages could be burned to the ground as a warning. But still they wrote, still they dared, and then somehow these letters slipped through the cracks of history. Maybe a sympathetic monk hid them. Maybe they were misplaced in a stack of routine documents overlooked by censors. Whatever the reason, their survival gives us something priceless: proof that even in the darkest corners of feudalism, ordinary people found ways to resist. They couldn't wield swords or pass laws, but they could write. And in those words, they left behind a legacy far more enduring than the castles of their oppressors. The first letter in that weathered wooden chest carries the weight of a revolution barely whispered. Thomas, a peasant from a small English village, dipped his quill in homemade ink and wrote with hands more used to gripping a plough than a pen. His words, scratched onto rough parchment in the year 1215, crackle with quiet fury. Just weeks after King John signed the Magna Carta under pressure from rebellious barons, Thomas and his neighbors made a daring claim that this document wasn't just for nobles. In crooked but determined script, he wrote of their collective decision to withhold grain taxes, calling it their own strike against tyranny. What's extraordinary isn't just their boldness, but how they reinterpreted history in real time. While lords argued over legal clauses, peasants like Thomas saw something radical, proof that even kings could be forced to bend. This letter didn't travel by royal courier. It was hidden inside a loaf of coarse rye bread, the crust resealed with dung paste to avoid suspicion. That humble disguise tells us everything about how rebellion moved through medieval Europe, not on horseback, but in market carts and pilgrims' satchels. When Thomas's letter reached the next village, it didn't just relay news. It offered a blueprint. His description of their tax strike spread to 5 neighboring communities within months, each adding their own grievances in the margins before passing it on like a fiery baton. But here's what chills the spine. Authorities nearly missed it entirely. The local sheriff dismissed early rumors of unrest as the grumbling of hungry fools. By the time he realized these peasants were quoting the Magna Carta back at him, specifically Clause 39's promise of no unlawful seizure, their movement had grown too large to crush quietly. Thomas's letter ends abruptly, mid-sentence, as if snatched away, yet the blank space speaks volumes. We know from court records that his village paid dearly for their defiance. But we also know 3 other villages rebelled that harvest season, using nearly identical phrasing in their own secret letters. The true power of Thomas's words lies in their stubborn humanity. He complains about his aching back, frets over his daughter's cough, and in one heartbreaking passage, wonders aloud if his newborn son will live freer than he did. This wasn't some grand manifesto. It was a working man's diary of desperation and hope, scrawled by firelight after digging ditches all day, and that's precisely why it resonated. When peasants elsewhere read his account of hiding seed grain under floorboards to starve out the tax collectors, they didn't see abstract ideals. They saw a neighbor's clever trick, something they could try tomorrow. Historians used to assume medieval peasants couldn't read well enough to organize resistance. Thomas's letter shatters that myth. His handwriting wobbles, yes, but his political awareness is razor sharp. He references not just the Magna Carta, but also the ancient customs of folk right, the unwritten rules villagers believed protected their fields and forests. That blend of new legal ideas and old traditions became the secret weapon of peasant rebellions for the next century, and it all started with a single letter, baked into bread like a seed waiting to sprout. Eleanor's letter from 1247 reads like a simple farmer's note at first glance, full of complaints about blighted crops and hungry livestock. But between those lines, hidden in plain sight, burns a call to arms. When she writes, "The wheat must rise before the first frost," she isn't talking about agriculture. That single phrase, scribbled in a mix of church Latin and regional dialect, was the spark for one of the most sophisticated peasant resistance networks of the 13th century. What makes her message so remarkable isn't just its clever disguise, but how it reveals a secret communication system stretching across entire regions. Peasants like Eleanor couldn't risk writing openly about rebellion, so they borrowed Latin words from church services, a language their lords heard daily but rarely understood deeply, and twisted them into new meanings. Frost meant tax collectors, ploughing stood for organizing meetings, even the ink itself carried clues. The brown hue of hers came from oak galls, a substance scribes used for important documents, signaling this was no ordinary farm letter. The real genius lay in how these codes were taught. Without written manuals that could be confiscated, peasants passed the system through folk songs and bedtime stories. A child learning a rhyme about the fox in the barley was actually memorizing instructions for smuggling messages. When Eleanor references the old songs in her letter, she's tapping into an oral tradition so subtle that even when authorities intercepted letters, they dismissed them as superstitious ramblings. But the most chilling detail, this letter nearly worked. Hidden beneath Eleanor's coded words is a map not drawn with lines but woven into her description of fence repairs. Specific landmarks like a lightning-struck oak or a bend in the river marked safe houses where rebels could gather. Historians, cross-referencing her account with local geography, found these spots formed a perfect ring around the county's tax collection points. Had a sudden illness not forced Eleanor to abandon her role as messenger, the planned uprising might have erupted months earlier, yet her words still traveled further than she ever imagined. A single phrase from her letter, "The crow flies at midnight," later appeared in peasant revolts as far away as Burgundy, proof that these coded messages crossed borders through pilgrim routes and merchant networks. That's the haunting power of Eleanor's letter. It shows us how oppression bred creativity. Denied formal education, peasants turned everyday objects and traditions into tools of resistance. A harvest festival became a cover for strategy meetings, a lullaby transformed into an instruction manual, and a woman who'd never held a sword crafted a weapon far more dangerous, a language lords couldn't hear, even when it was shouted right in front of them. Brother Oak's letter from 1263 doesn't just ask for unity, it demands it with the urgency of a man who knows time is running out. The ink stains are darker in some places, as if his quill pressed harder when he wrote certain words. "Alone, your village starves. Together we feast." At a time when most peasants rarely traveled beyond their own fields, this call to bridge divides was nothing short of revolutionary. What makes this letter so extraordinary isn't just its message, but how it traveled. Unlike Tomas's bread-hidden note or Eleanor's coded farming complaints, Brother Oak's words were sewn into the very fabric of a wool merchant's coat, stitched between layers of coarse linen where no official would think to look. That merchant, whose name we'll never know, became an unwitting revolutionary, carrying whispers of rebellion from market to market along trade routes usually reserved for salt and iron. The logistics alone was staggering. Every stitch in that hidden compartment had to be perfect, too loose, and the parchment might rustle and give itself away, too tight, and the fabric would pucker under a sheriff's suspicious gaze. Yet somehow, this letter reached 7 villages across 3 counties before authorities caught wind. Even then, they missed the real threat. When the merchant was finally searched, guards tore open his money pouch but never thought to check the hem of his coat. Brother Oak understood something feudal lords never did. Oppression thrived on isolation. By convincing villagers to see their struggles as connected, to recognize that the same lord starving one community was bleeding another dry, he turned scattered frustrations into collective power. His letter recounts a folk tale about wolves hunting deer. One wolf snaps at a herd and the deer scatter to their doom. But if the herd stands shoulder to shoulder, their antlers become a wall no wolf can breach. That simple analogy, drawn from the natural world peasants knew intimately, made the abstract idea of solidarity feel as real as the soil under their feet. The risks were unimaginable. At the bottom of the parchment, nearly faded away, are 19 tiny marks. Some historians believe these were the seals of villages that pledged support. If that list had been discovered, entire communities could have been wiped off the map. Yet Brother Oak didn't just ask for blind trust. He proposed something radical for the time, a council where each village would send one representative to speak for them, with disputes settled by vote rather than force. It was grassroots democracy centuries before the word existed. And here's the tragic twist: we know this letter worked too well. Chronicles from 1264 describe unrest across the northern counties and lords complaining of peasants forgetting their place. But Brother Oak himself disappears from records after that year. Maybe he died quietly in his sleep. Maybe he fell to a lord's vengeance. What matters is that his words outlived him. 5 years later, when the Great Peasant Revolt of 1268 erupted, survivors' accounts describe rebels quoting phrases from his letter verbatim. That's the power of an idea stitched into a coat's lining. Once it slips through, no army can unhear it. Margaret's letter from 1271 shatters the silence surrounding women's role in medieval rebellion. While chroniclers of the time rarely mentioned female rebels, focusing instead on sword-wielding men, her words reveal a different truth. Women didn't just support revolts from the sidelines, they engineered them. As a midwife traveling between villages, Margaret had the perfect cover. No one questioned her bundles of herbs or the hours spent in lonely cottages. But tucked between layers of yarrow and comfrey were scraps of parchment detailing guard rotations, and woven into her belt were threads dyed different colors, a secret code signaling which lords' granaries were least defended. Her letter describes a brilliance born of necessity. While men faced brutal reprisals if caught conspiring, women used society's blindness to their advantage. Spinning circles became strategy sessions, with the rhythmic clack of distracts masking whispered plans. A basket of mending could hide a map, its embroidered stitches marking safe paths through the forest. Even childbirth played a role. Margaret recounts how one rebellion was timed to coincide with a noblewoman's labor, knowing the lord's household would be distracted. But the most striking passage details her food network. While lords watched granaries for stolen grain, Margaret and others quietly siphoned supplies through a chain of trusted women. A handful of flour here, a wedge of cheese there, all delivered in the guise of charity to poor widows. These stockpiles fed rebel bands hiding in the woods, turning what should have been a week-long standoff into a months-long siege. Her account forces us to rethink medieval power structures. Women couldn't hold swords, but they controlled something far more vital: the flow of information and resources through everyday acts no one thought to monitor. Margaret's letter ends with a chilling observation. She notes that after a failed uprising, authorities rounded up and burned every loom in the village, not the weapons, the looms. That tells us everything. The real threat wasn't the occasional peasant with a pitchfork. It was the quiet women who could weave rebellion into the fabric of daily life, turning chores into weapons and gossip into a courier system. Centuries later, her words still resonate with urgency, reminding us that history's most powerful revolutions often begin not with battle cries, but with the steady, unnoticed work of those the world chooses not to see. The monk's quill trembled as he wrote in 1285, his words smudged in places where ink mixed with candle wax, or perhaps tears. What makes this letter so extraordinary isn't just its confession of divided loyalties, but how it cracks open the Church's carefully constructed facade of unity. Here was a man of God, sworn to uphold divine order, secretly slipping out at night to bless peasant rebels in moonlit clearings. By day, he stood before crowds condemning the very uprisings he'd encouraged hours earlier. The parchment practically vibrates with his anguish. I preach obedience from the pulpit, then whisper rebellion in the confessional. Which is the greater sin? This wasn't just one man's crisis of conscience, it mirrored a fault line running through medieval Christianity. The church taught that feudal hierarchy was God's design, yet Christ's teachings brimmed with compassion for the poor. Some clergy resolved this tension by handing out alms while defending the status quo. Others, like our unnamed monk, risked everything to side with the oppressed. His letter reveals a clandestine network of sympathetic priests who used their unique position to aid rebellions without detection. They'd announce feast days requiring extra tithes, a signal for rebels to gather under cover of religious observance. Communion bread sometimes hid scraps of parchment with troop movements. Even the seemingly innocent act of ringing church bells could serve as a warning system when authorities approached. But the monk's most startling admission concerns the Bible itself. Peasants rarely owned books, let alone scripture, so rebellious clergy began inserting subversive interpretations into sermons. Passages about Pharaoh's oppression of the Israelites suddenly sounded suspiciously like critiques of local lords. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus became a rallying cry against hoarded wealth. When I speak of heavenly rewards for the meek, the monk writes, their eyes burn brighter than any cathedral candle. The letter's survival is its own small miracle. Discovered wedged inside a 13th century psalter, it avoided destruction because the ink matched the prayer book's script, likely copied by another sympathetic cleric who couldn't bear to see these truths erased. Between the lines, we glimpse a chilling reality. The church's internal spies were watching their own. The monk mentions confessors who reported rebellious thoughts to bishops and scribes who altered records to erase evidence of clerical dissent. His final sentence breaks off mid-word as if interrupted. The parchment's edge shows signs of having been hastily torn, leaving us forever wondering whether he was caught or simply ran out of time to finish his confession. What lingers isn't just the tragedy of one torn soul, but the quiet revolution he represents. For every priest who blessed a lord's sword, there was another smuggling hope to the hopeless. Their legacy lives on in the stubborn resilience of faith itself, the idea that true devotion might sometimes mean disobeying earthly powers to serve a higher justice. The monk's letter forces us to ask, when institutions meant to uplift the vulnerable instead prop up oppression, is rebellion not just permitted but holy? The hollowed-out candle that carried the rebel leader's letter in 1292 wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a perfect metaphor for the rebellion itself. On the surface, it appeared ordinary, even pious, meant to light some noble's chapel, but inside burned a fire capable of reducing entire systems to ash. The letter's instructions were chillingly precise. Target only the barns where grain was hoarded, avoid harming livestock or homes, and strike simultaneously across 12 estates under cover of a new moon. This wasn't mindless violence. It was economic warfare waged by people who understood their oppressor's weakest point, not the castle walls but the ledger books. What made the night of the burning barn so revolutionary was its surgical efficiency. Peasants had rioted before, but always in spontaneous bursts of rage. This letter reveals something far more dangerous, a calculated strategy. The rebel leader, who signed only as the cobbler, didn't just order fires, he included diagrams showing exactly where to cut ventilation holes in barn walls to create updrafts, ensuring flames would consume grain stores too quickly to extinguish. His directions read like a military campaign with coded references to which villages would provide lookouts, which would smuggle pitch, and which would feign ignorance afterward. Every contingency was planned down to the alibis. Let your hands blister at the loom all evening so none can say you held a torch. The candle hiding place itself was a stroke of genius. Wax concealed the letter's bulge, and the faint scent of tallow masked any lingering sweat or smoke from nervous couriers, but the real brilliance lay in distribution. Rebels didn't pass the candle hand to hand. They left it in church vestibules where anyone could take it, ensuring if one carrier was caught, they couldn't betray the network. This decentralized system meant the plan spread like wildfire even before the fires began. When dawn broke that December morning, the scale of the operation became clear. 12 barns smoldered from Kent to Yorkshire, their grain stores reduced to charred husks. Panicked lords suddenly faced a choice: negotiate with peasants they'd never considered worth acknowledging or starve alongside them come winter. The cobbler's letter had anticipated this too, demanding not land or titles, but something far more subversive: fixed grain prices and public audits of tax collections. For the first time, peasants weren't begging for mercy, they were dictating terms, yet the letter's most enduring legacy isn't its tactics, but its psychology. The cobbler understood that symbols could terrify where swords failed. Burning an empty barn carried no blood guilt, yet it struck at the heart of noble identity, their wealth and control over life itself. For decades after, just mentioning the night of the good fires made landlords flinch, and that hollowed-out candle, it became a rebel icon, reproduced in clay and smuggled between villages as a silent promise. Light could come from unexpected places, and even the smallest flame could illuminate the path to freedom. The parchment from 1301 smells faintly of salt and iron, its edges crumbling where angry fingers once gripped too tight. Gregor's betrayal didn't just fracture a rebellion, it shattered the very idea of trust among people who had nothing left but each other. The letter's author, a woman named Helois, writes with a quill dipped in fury, her words slashing across the page. May his bread turn to ash, his children forget his face, and the earth refuse his bones. But beneath the rage lies something far more devastating, a meticulous record of how one man's weakness unraveled years of planning. Gregor wasn't some outsider. He'd helped dig the underground chambers where rebels stored stolen grain, knew every hidden path through the marshes, and once carried a wounded comrade 12 miles on his back. That's what made his treachery so poisonous. When lords offered pardons to any peasant willing to name names, they expected desperate fools to come forward. Instead, they got a hardened rebel, a man who'd sworn oaths in blood, breaking under the weight of a single promise. His family would keep their strip of farmland if he talked. The letter reveals how betrayal worked like a sickness in rebel ranks. After Gregor's confession, authorities didn't just raid hideouts, they staged elaborate traps. A barn supposedly safe for meetings would already be surrounded by archers. Food caches were left untouched, watched for weeks until starving rebels crept back. Helois describes finding her brother's body propped against a mill wheel, a loaf of bread placed in his lifeless hands as if to mock their hunger. The cruelty was calculated, make trust itself feel like a death sentence. Yet the aftermath holds a startling twist. Faced with total collapse, the survivors didn't abandon their cause, they reinvented it. New oaths were sworn not on Bibles or relics, but on everyday objects only peasants would understand. A handful of soil meant loyalty to the land and its people. A broken plowshare symbolized resistance that couldn't be mended back into servitude. Even children's games changed, with rhymes teaching them to spot spies through subtle cues. A too clean tunic, unfamiliar calluses on the hands. The most haunting detail isn't the bloodstains on the parchment. It's the tiny, careful stitches along one edge where Helois sewed the letter into her own dress for safekeeping. That act alone speaks volumes. After Gregor, rebels stopped burying their secrets in the earth. They carried them on their bodies, turning garments into archives and scars into maps. Trust didn't disappear, it just became smaller, fiercer, and harder to earn. When Helois writes, "We now measure loyalty in silences," she's describing a revolution within the revolution. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do isn't shout your defiance, but choose who gets to hear you whisper. The legend of Father Wolf begins with a single scorched scrap of parchment from 1310, its edges charred where someone tried and failed to burn away its heresy. What remains tells the story of a priest who traded his cassock for a wolfskin cloak, holding mass under oak trees instead of cathedral arches. His sermons weren't about obedience, but justice, twisting scripture into a weapon even the illiterate could wield. When he quoted Christ driving money changers from the temple, peasants heard permission to raid tax collectors. His interpretation of "the meek shall inherit the earth" became a battle cry, proof that God favored their rebellion. This wasn't just radical theology, it was strategic genius. Father Wolf understood that peasants who'd flinch at stealing a loaf of bread would pillage a lord's storehouse without hesitation if they believed heaven sanctioned it. His letters, scrawled on parchment stolen from monastery scriptoriums, circulated like sacred texts. Each was sealed with a crude wolf's head pressed into wax, a symbol that transformed from warning to badge of honor. One surviving account describes a village butcher who risked his life to save a single page, hiding it inside a slaughtered pig's carcass as soldiers ransacked his shop. The authorities' panic was palpable. Church decrees denounced Father Wolf as Satan in shepherd's guise, while noble proclamations promised land grants for his capture alive. But hunting him proved impossible. He moved through forests like mist, using ancient pilgrim paths and deer trails unknown to horsemen. Rumors swirled that he could charm wolves into standing guard or vanish into thin air when pursued. The truth was simpler. A vast network of supporters, from charcoal burners who signaled with smoke patterns to tavern wenches who slipped sleeping drafts into soldiers' ale. His greatest innovation was the Forest Cathedral, a clearing where rebel bands gathered on saints' days, blending religious observance with military training. Drills were disguised as folk dances, sword practice as reenactments of David and Goliath. When spies reported these gatherings, lords dismissed them as superstitious peasant nonsense. That arrogance cost them dearly. By the time they realized these were musters for coordinated attacks, Father Wolf's followers had mastered nighttime raids, using owl calls to coordinate across miles of woodland. The mystery of his disappearance only fueled the legend. Some say he fell defending a village, his body carried away by his wolf pack. Others claim he walked into the sea, promising to return when the poor cried out again. Whatever the truth, his influence outlasted him. 6 decades later, when Wat Tyler's rebels stormed London in 1381, chroniclers noted many wore wolf teeth around their necks, a silent tribute to the heretic priest who taught them holy wrath could wear a peasant's face. Deep in the blackthorn thickets of Burgundy, where even royal foresters feared to tread, the trees hid more than wolves and wild honey. They sheltered an entire village that shouldn't have existed. The letter describing this haven, penned in 1324 by a runaway plowman named Jahan, reads like a fever dream at first. No tithes, no whipping posts, no lords riding through fields to claim their share. Just 43 souls building what Jahan called a world turned right side up. What began as a handful of escaped serfs stealing seed grain and axes became something extraordinary, a functioning community where every family worked according to ability and received according to need, long before philosophers put names to such ideas. Their survival depended on secrecy and the forest's abundance. Jahan's letter details how they hollowed out ancient oaks to store grain, wove living willow branches into fences that grew stronger each year, and dug pit houses beneath mossy clearings so the settlement remained invisible from even a stone's throw away. But the real revelation lies in their governance. Without nobles or priests to dictate terms, they held nightly talk circles around a central fire, resolving disputes by consensus. Children learned letters by scratching them in bark, while elders preserved forbidden knowledge like how certain mushrooms could dull a wound's pain or which streams never ran dry in summer. For nearly 10 years, they didn't just survive, they thrived, hosting other runaways in hidden way stations along forest trails. The letter's burial in a clay pot hints at why this experiment ended. Jahan writes of a child's careless footprint in river mud, noticed by a trapper who traded pelts for silver. When soldiers finally stormed the village at dawn, they found empty dwellings still warm from banked hearths. The inhabitants vanished like morning mist. But Jahan's words outran the raid. His description of shared harvest feasts and communal child rearing circulated for decades, copied onto scraps of hide and tucked into pilgrims' shoes. Some phrases even resurfaced verbatim during the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358, proving ideas could be harder to eradicate than people. What chills the spine isn't just the village's fate, but its very possibility. This wasn't some isolated hermit's cabin. It was an entire alternative society operating under feudal Europe's nose. Jahan's account forces us to reconsider medieval peasants not as passive victims, but as pragmatists who, when pushed too far, could imagine and briefly build a world where the only crown was the canopy of leaves overhead. The blacksmith's letter from 1331 smells of scorched iron and defiance, its ink mixed with soot from the forge where rebellion took physical form. What looks like a simple inventory of farm repairs is actually a blueprint for revolution, each plowshare deliberately weakened to snap into a blade, each sickle's curve honed to slit throats as easily as wheat stalks. His greatest pride wasn't the weapons themselves, but how perfectly they hid in plain sight. A wagon axle that unscrewed to reveal a spearhead, a butter churn's paddle with a handle that twisted off to become a club. Even children's toys weren't spared his subversive genius. Wooden tops weighted with lead to stun sentries when flung with precision. This blacksmith, who signed himself only as the anvil that breaks hammers, understood something kings never grasped. Peasants didn't need armories when their entire world could become weapons. His letter describes teaching farmers to repurpose their most mundane tools, how to twist a hayfork's tines into a man-catcher or fashion arrowheads from broken scythe blades. But the real stroke of brilliance was in distribution. Newly repaired tools would circulate through villages under the pretense of borrowing. A plow lent to a neighbor came back with its secret modifications, spreading arms without arousing suspicion. The horseshoe hiding his letter was poetic justice. Lords required peasants to bring their tools for inspection monthly, searching barns and carts for hidden weapons. But no one thought to check the shoes of the very horses that carried those inspectors. For 3 years, his arsenal spread across the county, each piece passing through the hands of unsuspecting tax collectors and sheriffs who literally carried rebellion beneath their saddles. What chills the blood isn't just the blacksmith's cunning, but his philosophy. In one passage, he writes of quenching red-hot steel in urine instead of water, a trick that made metal harder but also carried symbolic weight. Let their own waste strengthen us, he scrawls, a visceral metaphor for how oppression had forged something unbreakable. This wasn't just about fighting back. It was about transforming the very instruments of peasant drudgery into liberation. A scythe that spent summers cutting grain could spend winters cutting down the men who stole that grain. The letter's abrupt end suggests it was intercepted. But the aftermath reveals the blacksmith's ultimate triumph. Records from 1332 describe baffled lords complaining of cursed tools, breaking at suspicious moments during peasant uprisings. One noble's diary laments how his prized plough repaired just that spring sprang apart during a rebellion to reveal a 3-foot blade. That's the blacksmith's legacy, not just weapons, but the indelible idea that anything in a peasant's hands could become a threat. Even the most ordinary object, like a horseshoe carrying a secret, might kick open the doors of history. Agnes's letter from 1342 arrives like a breath held too long, a document so quiet it seems to hum with tension. Unlike the fiery manifestos or coded battle plans of other rebels, her words describe a weapon that left no bruises, spilled no blood, yet struck deeper than any blade. The tactic was deceptively simple. When the king's tax collectors rode into her village, not a single peasant would speak to them. Not a word of greeting, not a muttered insult, not even a child's cry broke the silence. Just 43 families staring straight through the officials as if they were ghosts. This wasn't mere stubbornness. Agnes details the meticulous planning behind what she called the silent strike. Villagers practiced for weeks, teaching children to bite their tongues and rehearsing hand signals to replace speech. They even devised a way to muzzle their dogs, not with cruelty, but with scraps of honeyed cloth to keep them contentedly licking instead of barking. The effect was uncanny. Tax collectors, accustomed to fear or groveling, found themselves unnerved by the void where expected resistance should be. One fled after 3 hours, convinced the village had been struck dumb by witchcraft. Another began shouting random names from his ledger, desperate for any reaction. The brilliance lay in its legality. Medieval law punished overt rebellion with hanging, but silence. There was no statute against a man refusing to open his mouth. Agnes recounts how the sheriff threatened to arrest the entire village for contempt of crown authority, only to have his own clerk point out no such charge existed. Even violence failed to break the spell. When a frustrated collector backhanded old man Peter, the victim wiped blood from his lip and smiled without uttering a sound. That moment, Agnes writes, was worth 1,000 speeches. But the letter reveals something darker too. The silent strike worked precisely because it weaponized the peasants' invisibility. Lords depended on their voices begging, confessing, answering accusations to maintain the illusion of control. Strip that away, and the powerful faced something far more terrifying: being ignored. Agnes describes how the village silence forced the taxmen to confront their own irrelevance, like actors performing for an empty hall. The aftermath proved even more startling. Without admissions or denials, collectors couldn't determine who owned what livestock or grain stores. Their ledgers, usually filled with forced confessions, remained blank. After 3 failed visits, the crown slashed the village tax quota just to avoid further embarrassment. Word spread. Within 2 years, silent strikes erupted across 5 counties, each one borrowing Agnes's tactics down to the honeyed dog muzzles. Her letter ends not with triumph, but a quiet observation. They can take our bread, our labor, even our lives, but they cannot make us say yes. In those words lies the true power of the silent strike. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a revelation that oppression requires complicity, and sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to play your part in the script. The 12th letter arrives like a gasp from the grave itself, a survivor's shaky hand writing in 1349, just as the Black Death's shadow began to recede. What makes this scrap of parchment so chilling isn't just its description of empty villages and piled corpses, but how clearly it recognizes the plague as a turning point. God's broom, the writer calls it, sweeping away not just lives but the old order. With half the population dead, peasants who once begged for work now set their own terms. A day's wages for reaping wheat, triple what it was before the pestilence. A loaf of bread, pay it or watch your fields rot. The letter's author, a carpenter named Mathias, recounts with grim satisfaction how his lord offered him a silver penny to rebuild a barn, and how he laughed in the man's face. Now they know what hunger tastes like, he scrawls, the ink blotting where his fist slammed the table. This wasn't just bitterness, it was economic revolution. Mathias's letter details how surviving laborers formed alliances across village lines, refusing to work unless their demands were met. When lords threatened imprisonment, the peasants had a ready reply: chain us, and who will plant your crops? Hang us, and who will grind your grain? For the first time, scarcity gave them leverage. A single sentence near the letter's end captures the seismic shift. The whip is still in his hand, but the arm that holds it trembles. Yet the true genius of this document lies in its foresight. Mathias didn't just record events, he planted ideas. His description of lords burning plague corpses to hide their dwindling workforce wasn't mere observation, it was instruction. Within months, villages 100 miles apart were using the same tactic, disguising organized work stoppages as pestilence precautions. Even the letter's survival hints at its power. Found stuffed inside a church statue of Saint Roch, patron of plague victims, it suggests sympathetic clergy helped circulate these incendiary words under the guise of holy relics. The aftermath proved Mathias right. By 1351, England's nobles pushed through the Statute of Labourers, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But the genie couldn't be forced back into the bottle. Peasants now knew their labor had value beyond what lords were willing to admit. That dawning awareness, scribbled on plague-stained parchment, would fuel revolts for generations, proof that sometimes the deadliest catastrophes don't just destroy. They create. Peter's toy horse was more than just a child's plaything. It was a hollow vessel of rebellion, carved with a secret compartment barely large enough to hold a scrap of parchment. His letter from 1355, written years later when he was a grey-bearded man, crackles with the nervous energy of a boy who knew too much too young. They never looked twice at a child's toy, he writes, describing how he'd trot past castle guards, humming nonsense rhymes while treasonous notes rattled inside his wooden steed. What makes his account so extraordinary isn't just the daring of using children as couriers, but the sophistication of the system. The rebels didn't choose children at random. Peter was selected because his father repaired armor for the local lord, a position that granted him access to courtyards where adults would be questioned. His younger sister, barely 6, carried messages too, stitching them into the hem of her doll's dress. Their innocence was the perfect disguise. Guards searching wagons for contraband would pat a boy's head and send him on his way, never dreaming that the nursery song he whistled was actually a coded weather report signaling safe passage for rebel bands. Peter's letter reveals how deeply the children were trained. They memorized entire maps by tracing them with their fingers in the dirt during games of hopscotch. A dropped handkerchief meant danger ahead, while tying a shoelace 3 times signaled that the route was clear, but the real genius lay in their cargo. Unlike adult couriers who might be tortured for information, children could truthfully claim ignorance. After all, who would suspect a wooden horse of holding secrets? One harrowing passage describes Peter's closest call. A suspicious guard snatched his toy and shook it, only for the compartment to stick. I laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world, Peter writes, and the fool laughed with me. That moment captures the cruel brilliance of the tactic. It weaponized the authorities' own condescension. Adults dismissed children as beneath notice, never imagining that the very people they refused to see could undo them. Years later, long after the rebellions faded, Peter buried his toy horse beneath an apple tree, a silent monument to the thousands of children who risked their lives not with swords, but with rhymes and riddles. His letter forces us to reconsider medieval childhood not as a time of sheltered innocence, but as an apprenticeship in resistance. While noble sons practiced swordplay, peasant children mastered something far more dangerous: the art of being overlooked. The scribe's ink-stained fingers trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion as he penned his list in 1360 by the guttering light of a single tallow candle. What looks like a simple inventory of farm tools is actually a coded catalogue of rebellion, each plough blade, a Bible translated into the common tongue, every sack of seed, a smuggled tract arguing that all men were born equal. This letter reveals something far more dangerous than swords or torches: the underground network of peasant literacy that turned quiet village gatherings into schools of sedition. Imagine a shepherd's cottage on a winter night, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and burning peat. A dozen field hands huddle around a fire, not for warmth, but for light, as one among them slowly sounds out words from a book wrapped in pigskin to muffle the rustling. These weren't just reading lessons, they were acts of war. The scribe's letter details how certain passages became rallying cries. When peasants heard Christ say, "The last shall be first," they didn't take it as spiritual comfort. They saw divine approval for turning the feudal world upside down. Hiding these books required genius. The scribe describes false-bottomed chests where holy texts lay beneath layers of wool, hollowed-out loaves of bread concealing political tracts. Even Bibles rebound as ledgers to fool inspecting eyes. But the real innovation was in distribution. Unlike weapons that could be confiscated, ideas once heard couldn't be unlearned. A single book might travel 20 miles in a night, passed from village to village at secret meeting points, a standing stone at midnight, a ruined chapel at dawn. By morning, it would vanish again, but the words lingered, whispered in fields and taverns until they took root. Authorities understood the threat better than the peasants themselves. A marginal note in the scribe's letter records a nobleman's panic upon finding a ploughman reading. It is more perilous to teach a serf his letters than to give him a spear. That fear was well-founded. Literacy broke the monopoly on truth. Once peasants could read laws and scripture for themselves, they noticed uncomfortable discrepancies like how the Bible never mentioned divine right of kings, or how ancient charters promised rights their lords had forgotten. The scribe's greatest pride wasn't his elegant penmanship, but his makeshift ink recipe. Crushed oak galls mixed with vinegar made a serviceable substitute for expensive imported ink, allowing him to copy texts faster than authorities could burn them. His letter boasts that 3 copied Gospels could be produced in the time it took a lord's courier to ride from one monastery to the next. This was guerrilla publishing, medieval style. Yet the most heartbreaking passage describes what happened when books were discovered. The scribe recounts watching from a hedgerow as soldiers burned a cottage, its straw roof exploding into flames that consumed not just a family's home, but the precious books hidden under the floorboards. The pages flew upward like doves, he writes, before turning to black snow. That image captures the paradox of this struggle. Ideas could be set alight, but not contained. Even as one text burned, its words lived on in the memories of those who'd heard them spoken aloud. By the letter's end, the scribe has stopped hiding behind metaphor. His final lines list real titles and their hiding places, as if daring fate to find them. That chestnut tree with the lightning scar, its hollow holds Wycliffe's Bible. The miller's 3rd sack of flour, stuffed with sermons declaring all men brothers. These weren't just hiding spots, they were landmines planted in the fertile soil of human curiosity, waiting to explode into consciousness. Long after the scribe's bones turned to dust, his greatest act of rebellion would endure, the unshakable belief that knowledge belonged to everyone, and that even the lowliest plowman had a right to read the words that might set him free. The 15th letter smells of damp earth and crushed berries, its jagged script running sideways across the page as if written in frantic secrecy. What unfolds isn't just an account of rebellion, it's a script for revolution disguised as street theater. In 1366, under a crescent moon, villagers gathered in a fallow field to stage something unprecedented, a trial where the accused was their absent lord, represented by a scarecrow stuffed with stolen tax records. The letter's author, a dyer named Coll, recounts every chilling detail: how they draped the effigy in a nobleman's discarded cloak, how the village blacksmith played bailiff with a hammer for a gavel, and how each peasant took turns stepping forward to accuse the straw-stuffed figure of crimes real and imagined. "You took my cow when my child starved," one woman shouted, flinging a clod of dirt at the effigy's head. "You bed my daughter and call it privilege," growled an old man, thrusting a scythe through its chest. This was more than catharsis, it was psychological warfare. Coll's letter reveals how the ritual borrowed sacred elements from medieval justice to lend it weight. Witnesses swore oaths on a rusted plowshare instead of a Bible. The Lord was denied a defender, just as peasants were in real courts. Even the verdict carried eerie echoes of noble decrees. We find the accused guilty of greed, cruelty, and treason against the people. When they burned the effigy, its tax-stuffed belly sent embers swirling skyward like fleeing coins. But the true stroke of genius came afterward. Instead of hiding their sedition, the villagers pinned Coll's letter to the ancient oak where royal proclamations were posted. There it dangled for 3 days before a horrified bailiff tore it down, 3 days where every passing serf could read the damning transcript. The act blurred the line between fantasy and reality so thoroughly that rumors spread of the Lord actually falling ill the night of the mock trial, writhing in fever dreams as if the straw effigy had been his uncanny double. What chills the spine isn't just the peasants' audacity, but their theatrical precision. They'd weaponized the very rituals meant to keep them docile. Trial ceremonies meant to showcase noble omnipotence became a template for their own justice. Even the letter's composition mimicked legal documents, right down to the forged seal pressed into berry juice at the bottom, a grotesque parody of noble wax sigils. Coll's account forces us to reconsider power's fragility. A lord might control land, weapons, and laws, but stories, those could slip through his fingers like smoke. By scripting their own narrative of guilt and punishment, the peasants did something far more dangerous than burn a barn. They planted the idea that authority could be not just resisted, but judged. Long after the scarecrow's ashes blew away, the memory lingered, a ghostly precedent whispering that if one court could be staged, perhaps another could be real. High in the windswept hills of 1372, where the bleating of sheep carried farther than any human voice, a shepherd named Hugh kept count in a way his lord would never understand. His letter, smudged with lanolin from years of handling wool, reveals how the most mundane act, counting flocks, became a revolutionary cipher. 10 white sheep meant 10 days until uprising. 3 black lambs signaled the number of armed guards at the crossroads. Even the direction a dog nipped at the herd's heels could indicate which manor house was least defended. To outsiders, it looked like simple pastoral life. In reality, it was a clandestine communications network spanning entire counties. Shepherds were the perfect conspirators. Their solitary work gave them freedom to move across contested lands without suspicion. Their hilltop vantage points offered unobstructed views of approaching soldiers or tax collectors. And their deep knowledge of terrain, every hidden gully and forgotten trail, made them invaluable guides for rebel bands moving under cover of darkness. Hugh's letter boasts how he once misdirected a Lord search party by sending them chasing after imaginary sheep thieves through a bog, buying precious time for a rebel group to disperse. The true stroke of genius was in the code's simplicity. Unlike complex ciphers that required literacy or special tools, this system built on skills every shepherd already possessed. Children learned it alongside basic flock management, innocently practicing counts that doubled as military intelligence. A lord riding past might hear a boy calling numbers to his dog and think nothing of it, never realizing those digits corresponded to grain stores or guard rotations. Even the sheep themselves became unwitting accomplices. Hugh describes dyeing select animals' wool with subtle marks, a blue-tinted ear marking a safe house, a red-stained flank warning of betrayal. But the most chilling detail lies in how authorities remained blind to the scheme. Nobles dismissed shepherds as simpletons, incapable of higher thought. When rumors of coded messages surfaced, they searched for parchment scrolls and sealed letters, never thinking to examine the very animals they taxed. Hugh recounts with grim satisfaction how a sheriff once interrogated him for hours, demanding to know where he'd hidden rebel correspondence. The whole time, the answers grazed peacefully in the nearby field, their numbered backs broadcasting secrets in broad daylight. The system's legacy outlasted the rebellions. Centuries later, during the German Peasants' War of 1525, reports surfaced of shepherds using nearly identical counting codes. Whether this was deliberate imitation or independent invention hardly matters. What Hugh's letter proves is that oppression breeds creativity in unexpected places, that even the most surveilled and underestimated people will find ways to turn their daily routines into acts of defiance. After all, who controls the narrative when the storytellers are the ones holding the tally sticks? The midnight market of 1378 didn't appear on any noble's ledger or royal map. It existed in the liminal hours between dusk and dawn, where the only lanterns were clusters of glowworms tied to sticks. The letter describing it, ink smudged by what might be dew or tears, reads like a dream journal entry. Last night, we traded under the bear's tail constellation, and for those few hours, no man called me serf. What began as a desperate workaround for crushing taxes became something far more radical, a shadow economy where peasants set their own rules, proving they didn't need lords to organize their world. Grain changed hands without the usual third taken by the bailiff. A blacksmith swapped a repaired plowshare for a wedge of cheese, bypassing the manor's monopoly on metalwork. But the real currency wasn't goods, it was trust. The writer describes how a shoemaker from 3 villages over would leave his best boots with a stranger, knowing the promised sack of barley would appear by next moonrise. No contracts, no seals, just the unspoken understanding that in this stolen space, their word was bond. What made these gatherings so dangerous to the established order wasn't the lost tax revenue, it was the alternative they represented. Under the stars, peasants practiced a rudimentary democracy. Disputes were settled by vote, with elders mediating while children slept wrapped in cloaks nearby. News traveled faster here than any royal courier could manage. A rhyme about a lord's misdeed in one county would become a rallying cry in another by week's end. The letter's author marvels at how a basket of eggs might come wrapped in a scrap of parchment, bearing the latest ballad from a rebellion 200 miles away. Security relied on animal instincts and stolen church bells. Lookouts perched in oak trees with cords tied to their toes. One tug would send the assembly scattering into the hedgerows. A stolen bell buried near the meeting spot could be rung once for a routine patrol, twice for armed riders. The genius lay in their mobility. Unlike stationary markets that lords could raid, this fair left no trace by dawn. Wheat sacks became sleeping pallets, stall poles turned back into fence posts, and the only evidence was a circle of trampled grass that would vanish after the next rainfall. Yet the market's greatest legacy wasn't its secrecy, it was the psychological shift it created. The writer describes a moment where an old woman, after decades of bowing to bailiffs, stood straight back to haggle over a bolt of wool. I watched her remember herself, he scribbles, the letters growing larger as if to match her newfound stature. That's what made these moonlit gatherings truly subversive. For a few hours each month, peasants didn't just evade feudalism, they forgot it ever existed. And as the letter's closing line warns with quiet triumph, no man who's tasted freedom forgets the flavor, no matter how thin the broth. The weaver's loom clicked and clacked like a conspirator's tongue, its shuttle darting back and forth as if whispering secrets between the threads. In 1380, a master weaver's letter, stuffed inside a bolt of cloth meant for a duke's banquet hall, revealed how rebellion wasn't just written or spoken, but woven into the very fabric of daily life. His patterns held hidden meanings. A zigzag border warned of soldiers garrisoned nearby, a cluster of red stitches signaled the night of uprising, and a deliberately uneven hem marked the homes of traitors who'd betrayed previous revolts. What looked like ordinary tapestries to noble eyes were actually maps, manifests, and muster rolls disguised as decoration. The genius lay in the medium's mundanity. While authorities tore apart peasant cottages searching for hidden letters, they draped their own halls with these coded textiles, oblivious to the treason hanging on their walls. The weaver's letter recounts how a particularly bold rebel stitched the lord's own coat of arms into a banner, then used its intricate foliage to hide troop counts and supply routes. Even the dyes carried meaning. Wode blue threads indicated safe river crossings, while ochre yellow marked contaminated wells best avoided by rebel bands. But the system's real brilliance was its scalability. A single tapestry could contain dozens of messages, each interpretable only to those who knew which layer of pattern to read. The weaver describes teaching his daughter to encode secrets in the warp while leaving the weft innocent, a dual-layered deception where even if someone suspected the cloth, they'd need to unpick it thread by thread to uncover the truth. This made interception nearly impossible. A soldier might confiscate a suspicious letter, but who would unravel an entire bedsheet on a hunch? The irony wasn't lost on the weaver. In one passage, he gloats about delivering a cushion embroidered with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus to the local bishop's private chapel. Let him rest his pious head on the words, "The poor shall inherit the earth," he scrawls, the ink blotted with what might be laughter. That's the cruelest twist. The very objects meant to showcase noble wealth and piety became Trojan horses, smuggling subversion into the heart of power. Yet the most poignant detail isn't the cunning or the audacity, it's the fragility. The weaver's letter was discovered not by authorities, but by a maid's errant scissors. While mending a torn curtain, she snipped through what seemed like an ordinary seam, only for a scrap of parchment to flutter out. Unlike the hidden stitches that could withstand centuries, this single slip unraveled an entire network. Within weeks, 3 weavers swung from gallows, their looms smashed into kindling, but the patterns, those proved harder to destroy. The letter's closing lines hint that copies of their most dangerous designs had already been sold to 20 noble households, their secrets preserved in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to read them. What makes this letter so haunting is its reminder that rebellion isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quietest things, the rhythm of a loom, the twist of a thread, the patience of hands that know every knot must hold, that fray the ropes of oppression stitch by stitch. Long after the weaver's name was forgotten, his legacy remained, proof that even beauty could be a weapon, and that the softest fabrics might outlast the hardest swords. The cobblestones of London trembled under thousands of feet in 1381, and one young apprentice's quill struggled to keep pace with history unfolding around him. His letter, hastily scrawled on stolen parchment and smuggled out in a baker's apron, doesn't just describe the peasants' revolt, it breathes with its chaos. You can almost hear the shouts between his smudged lines. They're saying what Tyler will make the king understand. The gates are open, and we march with scythes sharpened like swords. What makes this account so electric is its raw immediacy, no hindsight, no moralizing, just the dizzying whirl of a revolution that might, for one fleeting moment, actually win. He writes of the surreal sight of peasants storming the Tower of London itself, their work-calloused hands tearing down tapestries that had hung since the conquest. The smell of burning tax record, sweet parchment smoke, mixed with a reek of melting wax seals, drifts from his words, but it's the small, human details that pierce through time. A blacksmith's widow distributing stolen wine in a dented cooking pot, a priest whispering absolution to rebels before they charged, the way the Thames glittered at dawn as if it too believed change was coming. Yet threaded through this euphoria is creeping dread. The apprentice notices things his comrades miss, how the king's negotiators keep glancing toward the archers on the rooftops, how Wat Tyler's charismatic speeches grow increasingly frantic. His letter captures the exact moment hope curdles. One paragraph describes Tyler striding forward to parley, his posture loose with confidence. The next jerks into horror as the mayor of London's dagger flashes. Wat falls, and the scream that goes up isn't battle fury. It's the sound of the world snapping back into its old, cruel shape. Most medieval chronicles were written by victors, their ink still sticky with flattery. This apprentice's account is different. It stumbles, contradicts itself, veers between triumph and despair, because that's what living through history actually feels like. When he describes the rebels scattering after Tyler's murder, his handwriting shrinks into tight, terrified spirals. We ran like mice who'd briefly mistaken themselves for lions. The miracle is that this fragile document survived at all. Hidden inside a hymnal and disguised with pious doodles, it avoided the bonfires of reprisal where so many rebel records burned. Its survival gives us something rare, not just the facts of revolt, but its heartbeat, the sweat, the sudden silences, the way a single voice shouting, "Now," could make cobblers and thatchers believe, just for a day, that they might remake the world. And perhaps that's why this letter still resonates, not because the rebellion succeeded, but because for one bright, bloody moment, people who were supposed to bow wrote their own story instead, and an apprentice, his fingers still stained with dye from his master's workshop, dared to record it. The prayer book's pages stuck together with dried blood where the letter had been pressed between psalms, not hidden, but almost enshrined. Dated 1385, 4 years after Wat Tyler's head adorned London Bridge, its words carry the weight of 1,000 silenced voices. "They burned our brother's body," the survivor writes, "but his ashes fertilize fields where new men will stand." What makes this document so extraordinary isn't its grief, though that runs deep as a grave, but its cold, clear-eyed strategy. Defeat hadn't crushed the rebellion, it had scattered its seeds. The writer, who signs only as the cobbler's apprentice, recounts how authorities dismantled the revolt's visible structures, gallows erected in every market square, village councils disbanded, even the communal ovens where rebels once baked bread together smashed to rubble. Yet beneath this show of force, something vital remained. The letter details how survivors repurposed funeral processions as covert meetings, how children's rhymes preserved battle plans in innocuous melodies, and how the very tools of repression became instruments of resistance. A hanged man's noose, left dangling as a warning, was secretly woven into straw dolls, a grotesque promise that martyrs wouldn't be forgotten. Most chilling is the account of how rebel networks adapted. Where once they'd rallied under banners, now they moved through guilds and pilgrimages. A stonemason's compass carved into a church pew marked safe houses. A baker's dozen 13 loaves instead of 12 signaled a coming gathering. Even the church's own rituals were subverted. When priests recited prayers for the dead, congregants heard coded tributes to fallen leaders. They think they've buried us, the apprentice scrawls, but we're the worms tunneling beneath their feet. The letter's survival hinged on a cruel irony. Hidden inside a confiscated prayer book stored in a noble's library, it avoided destruction precisely because victors assumed no peasant would dare deface scripture. For decades, it lay undisturbed until some curious clerk's fingers brushed against its edges, releasing words meant to outlast empires. What lingers isn't just the defiance, but the pragmatism. This wasn't romantic bravado. The writer knows ideas alone can't topple thrones. His closing lines detail a 20-year plan: infiltrate Scribe schools to control records, train a generation of lawyers to weaponize the law, and above all, wait. Let them think they've won, he advises. Spring's first shoots break ground only after winter's convinced the world it's eternal. That's the true power of this letter. It transforms what history calls failure into something far more dangerous. A comma in a sentence feudalism assumed had ended with a period. The melody clung to the rafters of peasant cottages like smoke from a hidden fire, soft enough to escape notice, persistent enough to never fully fade. The letter from 1390, its edges frayed where too many hands had unfolded and refolded it, contained lyrics so dangerous the writer dared not title them. Just a single instruction scribbled at the top: sing it softly, but sing it always. What makes this scrap of parchment extraordinary isn't just the words themselves, but how they traveled. Banned by royal decree after the Great Revolt, the song should have vanished like so many rebel dreams. Instead, it lived in lullabies hummed to sleeping children, in drinking tunes slurred just loud enough to blame on ale, in the rhythmic clang of blacksmith's hammers beating out its cadence against anvils. This was no simple folk tune. The lyrics, when decoded, mapped the locations of rebel safe houses using landmarks only locals would recognize: the crooked oak by Miller's Brook, the standing stone shaped like a hound's head. The chorus, seemingly about seasonal planting, actually listed the moon phases most favorable for nighttime meetings. Even the melody served a purpose. Its rising and falling notes matched the hand signals rebels used to communicate across crowded market squares. Authorities could confiscate weapons and burn manifestos, but how do you arrest a song once it's taken root in people's throats? The letter's author, a minstrel whose name was carefully omitted, understood music's unique power. Unlike pamphlets that required literacy or weapons that could be seized, a melody needed no tools beyond memory and breath. It could cross language barriers, leap over castle walls, and most dangerously adapt. By the time the song reached its third village, new verses had sprouted like wildflowers, mocking the local tax collector or commemorating a hanged rebel. Each alteration made it harder to trace, as if the song itself was a living thing, evolving to survive. One heartbreaking passage describes a grandmother teaching the tune to her granddaughter while kneading dough, their hands pressing the rhythm into the bread. "If they take me," she whispers, "you'll still have this." That's the true genius of cultural resistance. It turns everyday acts into vessels of defiance. A woman weaving at her loom might be keeping time with a band melody. A shepherd whistling to his dog could be signaling allies. Even silence played its part. The letter mentions villages where the song was never sung aloud, only tapped silently on tabletops or clicked with tongue and teeth, a ghost melody haunting the air between words. The miracle is that we have this letter at all. Found tucked inside the hollowed-out neck of a lute, it survived because music masters were among the few peasants allowed to travel freely between noble estates. The minstrel who carried it likely performed the very song it contained for lords who never suspected their entertainment was a rebel anthem. That irony would have pleased him. After all, what better revenge than making your enemies dance to the rhythm of your resistance? Long after the revolt was crushed, the song endured. Fragments of its lyrics surfaced in tavern brawls centuries later, and its distinctive cadence can still be heard in some regional folk tunes today, proof that while swords rust and laws decay, a melody with a purpose never truly dies. The letter's closing line, smudged by what might be wine or blood, says it best. They can break our bones, but they'll never unhear us. The 22nd letter crumbles at the edges, its once dark ink faded to the color of old blood. Dated the winter of 1401, it carries neither battle plans nor coded messages, just the shaky hand of a man who outlived his revolution. I plant these words like seeds in barren soil. The writer begins, and suddenly we're not reading history anymore. We're receiving a bequest. This was no young firebrand, but an elder who'd seen comrades hanged, promises broken, and hope buried more times than he could count. Yet his letter pulses with stubborn vitality. He recounts how rebels once smuggled messages in funeral shrouds, how children's nursery rhymes preserved forbidden truths, how the very tools of oppression tax ledgers, courtroom docs, even the whipping post became classrooms where peasants learned the language of resistance. They think they're teaching us obedience, he scrawls, when really they're showing us how power works. What makes this farewell so devastating is its clarity. The old rebel doesn't pretend victory is certain or even likely. He knows better, but he understands something deeper, that oppression thrives on forgetting. So he leaves meticulous instructions, which hollow tree still holds weapons wrapped in oilskin, which miller's daughter knows every verse of the rebel ballads, which abbey's cellar hides a chest of translated Bibles beneath the wine cask. These aren't just practical directions, they're a relay runner's final pass of the baton. The letter's survival is its own quiet miracle. Buried with him in an unmarked grave, it lay undisturbed until a plow struck the rotting chest 5 centuries later. The farmer who found it nearly burned the parchment for kindling before noticing the writing. That near loss haunts the text itself. Perhaps no one will read this. The old man concedes at one point, the ink smeared where his pen lingered too long. But to write it is to believe someone might. Today, as we unfold this fragile page, we fulfill that belief. When he describes the scent of oak gall ink mingling with damp earth in hidden meeting places, we're there beside him. When he recounts watching a village girl memorize legal arguments by stitching them into embroidery patterns, we see her fingers moving. This is more than a historical document. It's a bridge across 600 years, built on the faith that someday strangers would care enough to listen. His closing lines weigh heavier than any manifesto. They call us defeated, he writes, but you don't bury seeds thinking they'll stay seeds. Then, with a flourish that belies his aged hand, he adds one last instruction. Read this aloud sometimes. The words miss being heard, and so we do, voices echoing his across centuries, proving some rebellions never truly end. They just wait for the right listeners to come along. The 25 letters scattered across that wooden chest don't just tell stories, they shatter myths. For centuries, we've pictured medieval peasants as a faceless mass, heads bowed beneath the yoke of feudalism. But these fragile pages reveal something far more dangerous. ordinary people who refused to accept their assigned role in history. Their words prove rebellion wasn't born in palace coups or battlefield speeches, but in the quiet spaces between the lines, where a shepherd's tally marks became troop counts, where a loom's pattern mapped escape routes, where a child's nursery rhyme carried encrypted orders. What makes their legacy so enduring isn't just their courage, but their creativity. Faced with overwhelming power, they didn't imitate knights or nobles, they invented entirely new forms of resistance. The blacksmith turning plows into blades understood something revolutionaries still grapple with today. Oppression thrives when you fight on its terms. But when you rewrite the rules, when you weaponize the mundane, when you hide your rebellion inside the rhythms of daily life, you force the powerful to confront a threat they can't see coming. These letters also expose the lie that change requires grand gestures. The peasant who sewed a manifesto into her dress and the minstrel who encoded battle plans in ballads knew something we often forget. Revolutions aren't always loud. Sometimes they're whispers passed between market stalls or symbols stitched into the hem of a cloak. The true power of their strategies lay in their subtlety, proof that you don't need an army when you have a network, or weapons when you have patience. And perhaps most strikingly, their struggles mirror our own. When Eleanor used Latin phrases from church services to outsmart her lords, she anticipated the coded language of modern activists evading censorship. The midnight markets where peasants traded freely under the stars, they're the ancestors of today's underground economies, where people bypass unjust systems with barter and trust. Even the way these letters survived hidden in loaves of bread, sewn into livestock harnesses, tucked inside prayer books, finds echoes in contemporary movements, where sensitive information travels through encrypted channels disguised as cat videos or shopping lists. But the deepest lesson lies in their understanding of cultural resistance. The old rebel who buried his letter knowing it might never be read grasped a truth that outlasts castles and crowns. Ideas don't expire. They sleep in the soil like seeds, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. That's why these 25 fragile pages still matter, not as relics but as reminders. Every time someone today tapes protest signs over tax records, or turns a pop song into a dissent anthem, or uses a meme to expose corruption, they're walking paths these peasants carved 6 centuries ago. The letter's final gift is the realization that no one is truly voiceless, only deliberately unheard. From Thomas's tax strike inspired by the Magna Carta to the cobbler's apprentice plotting legal subversion, these writers prove that even the most marginalized people think critically about justice, strategize collectively, and dream beyond the boundaries set for them. Their words didn't just slip past medieval censors, they vaulted over centuries to challenge us now, because the real question isn't whether ordinary people can change history. These letters prove they already have. The only mystery left is who will pick up their pens next. The parchment crackles with the weight of its own survival. Each of these 25 letters exists not because history preserved them, but because someone risked everything to hide them. Authorities didn't just suppress peasant rebellions, they waged a war against memory itself. Tax collectors burned entire village archives. Sheriffs paid scribes to alter court records, turning uprisings into riots and leaders into bandits. Even folk songs were rewritten, their revolutionary verses replaced with lines praising feudal obedience. This wasn't just censorship, it was a calculated effort to make dissent disappear as if it had never existed. Consider the fate of one letter that didn't make it, a manifesto from the Revolt of 1322, seized by a bishop's men. Chronicles describe how it was paraded through the streets on a pitchfork before being fed to the flames, while a town crier announced, "Thus perish all treasonous words." The spectacle wasn't just about punishing rebels, it was a lesson in collective forgetting. Surviving records from noble households reveal startling honesty in private correspondence. One lord advised his son to burn every scrap of their writing, lest serfs learn the poison of ideas. Yet against this machinery of erasure, the 25 survivors slipped through. Some were saved by sheer improbability, like the letter stuffed into a hollow altar cross, overlooked when soldiers ransacked the church. Others owed their survival to cunning. A cooper's daughter in Normandy soaked a plea for aid in alum and vinegar, turning the parchment into a makeshift drumhead that hung in plain sight for decades, its message silent until a historian held it up to light. The most haunting might be the scrap sewn into a burial shroud, its ink fading into the weave until modern imaging techniques teased out syllables, "Remember us." The methods of concealment reveal as much as the words themselves. Peasants hid letters where their oppressors would never think to look, inside beehives, beneath chicken coop flooring, even woven into the thatch of roofs. One was found curled inside a ram's horn, a nod to the biblical story of Joshua bringing down walls. These weren't random hiding spots, they were acts of symbolic defiance. By tucking rebellion into the mundane, a loaf of bread, a child's toy, a shepherd's staff, peasants turned their entire world into a secret archive. What's equally startling is how many were found by accident. A farmer plowing his field struck a clay pot containing 3 letters in 1380. A monk repairing a manuscript discovered another pressed between its pages like a dried flower. Each survival is a minor miracle, a crack in the facade of feudal control. Historians now suspect these 25 are just the beginning, fragments of a much larger tapestry of resistance, most threads cut deliberately short. The letter's reappearance isn't just scholarly luck, it's a reckoning. Every time one surfaces, whether in an antique book binding or behind the wattle of a medieval cottage, it forces us to confront how much was stolen. These words weren't meant to be relics behind glass. They were living things passed hand to hand, meant to spark action. When we read them now, we're not just uncovering history. We're completing a delivery 6 centuries overdue. These 25 fragile letters are not just whispers from the past, they're a mirror held up to our own world. When Thomas pressed his quill into parchment 8 centuries ago, or when Margaret sewed rebellion into the hem of a dress, they weren't just fighting feudal lords. They were etching a truth that echoes through every era. Oppression may wear different faces, but the human spirit's refusal to bow remains the same. That's why these letters feel unnervingly alive today. The blacksmith who turned plowshares into weapons would recognize the ingenuity of modern activists' 3D printing protest tools. The minstrel encoding maps into song lyrics would understand how TikTok dances can smuggle subversive messages past censors. What's most startling isn't how much has changed, but how little. The tactics differ. Where peasants once hollowed out candles to hide letters, we encrypt files, but the heartbeat of resistance beats identically. When Eleanor twisted Latin prayers into rebel code, she anticipated the way marginalized communities today reclaim language, turning slurs into badges of pride or co-opting corporate jargon to mock power structures. Even the midnight markets, where peasants traded freely under the stars, find their counterpart in cryptocurrency networks and underground economies circumventing unjust systems. Yet these letters offer more than just historical parallels, they're masterclasses in hope. The old rebel who buried his words like seeds knew something we often forget: revolutions aren't always televised. Sometimes they're scribbled on scraps, passed through trusted hands, and planted in the unlikeliest places. His faith that someday someone would dig up those words and understand wasn't naive. It was strategic because oppression's greatest weakness is its arrogance. Tyrants burn books, ban songs, and tear down statues, never realizing they're fertilizing the very ideas they try to erase. So if these peasants could speak to us now, they might not offer grand advice. More likely, they'd ask questions. Why do you think your chains are any heavier than ours? What mundane tools surround you that could become weapons of change? Who have you forgotten to listen to? Their greatest lesson isn't about barricades or manifestos, it's about attention. They noticed the cracks in the system, the sheriff who never checked horseshoes for messages, the lord who dismissed shepherds counting songs as nonsense, the bishop who couldn't imagine a weaver's loom plotting revolution. That's why these letters demand more than our admiration. They challenge us to look closer at our own world, to see the potential for defiance in everyday objects, to hear the hum of rebellion in familiar melodies, and most of all, to recognize that no one is truly powerless unless they believe the story written for them. The parchment may be brittle, but the ideas, those are fireproof. Now it's your turn. What forgotten voices from history inspire you to rethink what's possible? Drop your thoughts below and let's keep these conversations burning. For more stories that turn history inside out, hit subscribe, because the past has plenty left to teach us if we're brave enough to listen.